Your Bibles to Ecclesiastes 1. I'm going to tell you right now it's a long sermon, and if you pay close attention at the beginning, it'll shorten it, okay? So it's all up to you, really. This is on you entirely. I need you to know that. It's hard at the beginning. It gets easier as it goes, and when you start thinking, much learning hath made you mad, I promise you it's not that. I'm not entirely mad, but you will think so in the next 5 minutes. But we'll get past that, and then it will become clearer as we go. A few weeks ago, standing above the Athenian Agora, the marketplace, think something like an outdoor mall, although it had covered spaces, I was wondering to myself, as I was walking that uneven surface on Mars Hill, what it must have been like for the Apostle Paul preaching the gospel to the people of Athens. And if you read the story in Acts 17, you get a sense that Paul was standing in that marketplace during various parts of his day. He's buying stuff that he needs for the day, but he's having these redemptive conversations with anyone who will speak to him. And during his time in Athens, apparently, Paul connects with people who are really interested in Greek philosophy. And if you know something about Greek philosophy, you probably know that some of the most famous philosophers of all time are on the list. And I'm referring, of course, to Socrates, and I'm going to use the English pronunciations here, okay? So this is not how they would have said these names, but this is how we say those names. Socrates, by the way, he's referred to as the father of Western civilization. And if you hear what I'm about to say, you'll understand why. Because Socrates taught in Athens, and he, by the way, they ended up killing him. He had to commit suicide by drinking hemlock, a poisoned plant. He had to drink the juice of a poison plant because they accused him of teaching ungodliness to young adults. But Socrates was so influential, and he lived about the time of Daniel in the Old Testament. And then after him was a student of Socrates named Plato. Again, that's the English pronunciation. And Plato, he was incredibly influential. And then he had a student named Aristotle. And Aristotle's approach to philosophy is the basis of the scientific method. Now, do you see how important this is? If you look at all the major achievements of Western civilization, they all trace their way through Aristotle to Plato to Socrates. That's why he's so important. And these were Athenians. It's amazing they're all living in this one city, about 400 to 350 years before Paul arrives. Now, before I talk about the two schools of thought that Paul bumped into in that famous marketplace, I need you to understand how important thinking and philosophizing was to these Athenian people. This is really important to them. About 100 years after Aristotle comes another Greek philosopher named Epicurus. And Epicurus is born on the island of Samos. It's in the eastern Aegean, actually not far from Kusadasi or Ephesus, for those of you who were on our trip. And as I mentioned, he was from Samos, but his parents were Athenian, and later, around 18 years old, he's going to go back to Athens, and he's going to become a student in the Platonic school. He's going to study from really important people who are coming out of Plato. Around the age of 32, he becomes the head of his own school called the Garden. His philosophy has been reduced, and I'm going to really simplify it here because we would take way too much time studying Greek philosophy to explain it all, but it's basically reduced to this. It's the value of pleasure over pain. And actually, I would say it this way, it's just live a simple life. And one of the main ideas, and when I say pleasure, I mean peace and tranquility, not just pleasure in a totally hedonistic sense. But people who advocated Epicurean philosophy would say withdraw from public life, so avoid politics. And if you know anything about the Athenians, they loved politics, right? They created democracy. They loved politics. Epicurus was highly influential, so influential that the Roman statesman Cicero, I'm sure you've heard of him, he would cite Epicurus 300 years after Epicurus' death and not far from the time of Paul. So very influential philosopher, Plato, Socrates, really influential. Luke writes that Paul began arguing with the Epicureans in the marketplace of Athens. So this is how important this is. His audience are Epicureans. But a chief rival, philosophically, of the Epicureans were the Stoics. And they got their name from their founder, a man named Zeno. And the word Stoic comes from the fact that he taught under a stoa, which is, if you go see all the ruins, what you realize is they're all missing their roofs. They all had columns and there were roofs. Everywhere you went, they had canopies. And I'm going to tell you, without those canopies, it is really hot walking around Greece. It is so hot. But you find they had stoas, they had canopies, and it would keep them cool. And Zeno taught under a covered pavilion, think like a pavilion. And Stoicism is pure rationalism. It was this belief that knowledge is gained through perception, and they emphasized the importance of restraining human nature. So the Stoics, they're founded about 300 years before Paul. Zeno also studied at Plato's academy, Plato, Socrates. You see the connection? And though he never met one of those famous Greek philosophers, the Stoics are notable for going through hardship and maintaining their composure. Zeno started his own school in Athens, in the Agora, the very place, Luke writes, that Paul met some of his disciples. So in Acts 17, Paul is in Athens on vacation. He's down in the mall area, the marketplace, and he's bumping into the followers of Epicurus and the followers of Zeno, who are teaching two radically different philosophies. And now Paul comes in teaching a third philosophy that is totally different from the other two. So if you realize what's basically happening here, you have Paul teaching his own philosophy, which is the gospel of Jesus, to people who are really interested in philosophy. And how does Christianity compare to Greek philosophy? Well, the Epicureans of Paul's day were all about the material, the atoms and the particles that make up matter. And so they basically rejected the idolatry of Athens. And by the way, isn't it interesting that when Paul is vexed in his spirit about the idolatry of Athens, so would have the Epicureans. They would have said, you all are crazy. Why would you even do this? Because this is not real. This is fake. The idol is real in the sense that it's material, but anything non-material is fake. And they rejected the idolatry of Athens. The Stoics, though, were pantheists. They believed that a little bit of God is in everything. So they're the complete other way. In fact, they were the ones who were championing the whole idea that there is all these gods. So on that day in Athens, some 2,000 years ago, Paul stood on this somewhat informal gathering on a rocky hilltop dedicated to the god Ares, Mars Hill, and told these philosophers that they both had it wrong. He's preaching to them Jesus and the resurrection. Both the Epicureans and the Stoics were attempting to think their way out of life's problems. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are looking at life and saying, there must be a way out of this. There has to be a way that we can think our way through this. They're trying to apply rationalism to life's problems. And the world in which we live today comes from that world. We still have people trying to think their way out of life's problems, just like first century Athens. We believe that given enough thought and given enough time, we can explain life and figure it all out. And that's what makes this so fascinating for me, because, at least, there was another philosopher. He lived some 500 years before Socrates, but he was guided by the Holy Spirit. And he said, I have the answer. In Ecclesiastes, Solomon explains that he was determined to put life to the test. He's going to figure this out. And in chapter 1, verse 17, he says it plainly. You need to understand that this is kind of a guide for the rest of Ecclesiastes. It's not necessarily the theme verse, but it's a guide to the rest of the book when he says, I gave my heart, and he's referring now to his inner self. I gave my whole self. We would say he was totally consumed with this idea. To know wisdom, that's intellectualism, and to know madness and folly, and that's hedonism. So if we're going to work our way past Solomon, get back to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and then Epicurus and Zeno, these offshoots, and all the other offshoots that came off of them, like the Cynics and all the other people. If we're going to look at all of them, we're basically coming down to two ideas. You can figure your way out of life either through intellectualism, which is kind of like Stoicism, or hedonism, which is not really exactly like Epicureanism, but it's similar. You can figure life out. And Solomon concludes after his experiment is over, and he writes Ecclesiastes, which is kind of his summation of what he figured out, is that neither of these two philosophies work. You can't think your way out, and you can't fun your way out. You can't do it. And they lead to the inevitable problem. There's something both of these philosophical things bump into eventually. And do you know what Solomon calls it? Hevel. It bumps into this problem. It keeps bumping into it. Every time you keep pursuing it out logically, you say, I can fund my way out, I can think my way out. You keep bumping into Hevel over and over again. And the best actions, Solomon reasons, can be reduced to Hevel simply by the fact that they're done out of a motivation that is inherently selfish. Stop for a moment and think about it this way. A missionary. These are our heroes. We love missionaries. We hopefully are a missions-minded church. A missionary may spend his life in foreign missions. He can give up a lot of things, family. He can give up friendships. He can give up living in a first world country to live in a third world country. But if his motivation isn't centered on God, at whatever level it's not centered on God, it's Hevel. A pastor can preach his entire ministry with a look at me philosophy. And I'm going to tell you, that's Hevel. And if missionaries and pastors can do it, how easy would it be for all of us to slip into the awful arms of Hevel? Things that should be good, like singing for God or worshiping in church or serving God in a church or even public prayer, they can all be influenced by Hevel. If God is not the center, the motive, the cause, the source of what we think and do, it is Hevel. One of our former missionaries comes from a family where his dad served in a local church in Western North Carolina for 25 years or more. And I'm going to tell you, this man held that church together. Built most of it with his own hands, the building at least. He was not just a leader there, he was one of the driving forces behind its success. Now today that church has been sold its buildings, has bought another building, has been renamed. There's a good pastor there. The church is going on for God, but it really struggled for a long time. But this man was the center of that church. And I actually know him pretty well. This missionary's dad, when he woke up one morning and decided to leave his wife and children for another woman and had no repentance at all in doing it, what came out was that all of his life he'd been living for the wrong things. And can I tell you what that is? Hevel, Hevel, Hevel. I've known Christian school and Christian college professors who sacrificed for years only to really find out in their later years that they were living for themselves. That's Hevel. Everything in life is influenced by it, affected by it, impacted by it. You can't get away from it. And modern man knows that. That's why he's following one of these two paths. I'm trying to get out of it intellectually. I'm trying to get out of it from a selfish, hedonistic sense. I'm going to fund my way out. I won't spend time explaining how these approaches go back through the centuries, but I think it's plain enough that they do, because Solomon says, I tried both of them, and both of them produced hevel in my life. So today we're just going to discuss the first of these. We'll discuss the second one later, but today let's look only at intellectualism. This is more common in our society than maybe you think. After all, knowledge is power. The more you know, the better educated you are, the more elite you become, the more potential you have in life. In athletics, we call their potential a ceiling. Athletes with a higher ceiling have greater potential for stardom. These are going to reach the Sports Hall of Fame in their respective sports. And in some sense, educationally, I think that's true. If you do have more education, you usually do better. People with more education do better in life than those who lack it. You're saying, wait a minute, you're contradicting yourself. I'm not. Solomon's going to admit that in Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, by the way. The more you know, the better you do. That's true. But it doesn't mean it's not hevel. Having a better life is not the same as having a more valuable life in God's eyes. A purpose-filled life. In fact, Solomon's point here is that intellectualism cannot save you from the problems of life. You can't think your way out. And that's Solomon's point. The accumulation of knowledge, which is good, does not fix the problem of hevel. So in fact, in any sense in which man relies on his knowledge as the answer to life's complexities, he proves over and over again that everything is hevel. So number one, our minds are not capable of solving God's riddle of life. Man erroneously believes he can solve life's enigma. Verse 12 of chapter 1, verse 13, I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom all the things that are done under heaven. The sore travail God has given to the sons of man to be exercised, and I've seen all the works that are done under the sun, and all is emptiness, frustration, and a chasing after the wind. Because what is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is wanting cannot be numbered. This is simply the pursuit of knowledge for knowledge's sake. Solomon uses two terms to describe the thoroughness of his pursuit. He says, I inquired, that is to seek deeply, to dive deeply into a subject, or he says, I spied it out. It's the idea to seek widely. So he's looking at everything, and some things he's really diving down deep to see if there's anything at the bottom of that intellectual well. And he did this so he could know about human life, the things that are done under heaven. So he's pursuing human knowledge, and he discovers there the futility of his goal. After drilling down into the wells of human intellectual life, he finds they're dry at the bottom. And he complains, it's a terrible job. It's a sore travail. It's a difficult occupation which just leads to greater weariness. That's what he's going to say in chapter 12 and verse 12. It's just wearying. You just hit the books, you're studying, you're learning, you think you have it down, and you find out at the bottom of that is nothingness, chasing after the wind. The pursuit of knowledge did not fulfill him like he thought it would. Intellectualism is, Solomon complains, somewhat meaningless, because you can never chase or never catch the wind. You can chase it, but even if you did catch it, what would you have in your hand? Just wind, nothing. So he finds that it's kind of hopeless. And you see his proverb, whatever is twisted cannot be straightened. Whatever is lacking cannot be counted. If it's not there, you don't count it. A nothing is a nothing. It's uncountable. It's nothing. Something that is inherently twisted cannot be straightened. And so Solomon says some problems can't be solved. There are twists in the fabric of life that do not unravel. And there are always more questions than answers. And even some things have no answer. We cannot gain enough information to know because we have a limited capacity in our knowledge. Can I just say to you, anytime you say, well, when I get to heaven, I'll know, that is absolutely not true. You will become like God in the sense of your sin life being gone, We will be like him, for we will see him as he is, 1 John 3:2. But it doesn't mean that your brain will become like God's brain. That's actually Mormonism, okay? You don't become a god. You're not eternal. You have everlasting life, but you still have a start date. God is eternal. He doesn't have a start or an end. And you will not become like God in the sense that your brain doesn't expand. You'll have access to more information for sure, because you'll see the things that you cannot see now, but it doesn't mean all of a sudden you just become this genius. Actually, I think part of eternity will be a constant learning in a good sense. It's school. Isn't that great? For the rest of eternity. Heaven. He says you don't have the capacity to understand. That's why intellectualism, letter B, cannot overcome Hebel. He says, in my own heart, verse 16, chapter 2, in my own heart I said, I have come to the great estate. I have come to this place that is incredible. Or chapter 1, verse 16. I have come to this great estate and gotten more wisdom than they that have been before me in Jerusalem. And my heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I gave my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. That's the hedonism side. And I perceived all of this as just a chasing after wind. I can gain more information about life. And that's Solomon's wholehearted pursuit. No one knew more than Solomon did. By the way, he's quoting here. He's quoting the Phoenicians. He's quoting all the different civilizations around him. He had lots of information. When the Queen of Sheba shows up, and we talk about the Queen of Sheba, we're saying, well, that's an expression we use for somebody who's really well off. The Queen of Sheba shows up and she says, I don't even know. I didn't even know the half of this. You're the greatest person in the world. And he was. No one knew more about the world than he did. He says this very thing to himself in a pride-filled rant. He had more theoretical knowledge than anyone else, more experiential knowledge than anyone else. He's the pinnacle of human intellectual achievement in a pre-scientific world. He is Socrates' superior. He pursued knowledge and achieved knowledge. And what he's saying really is, I left no stone unturned. That's the way we put it. He looked at every book he could find. He read every philosopher he could discover. And he found at the end of each book, Hevel. At the end of each philosophy, Hevel. My friends, knowledge cannot solve God's riddle of life by thinking its way out of God's riddle of life, and thus intellectualism fails. Which brings us to our second point. Attempting to solve man's life problem intellectually will fail. If Solomon couldn't do it, you can't do it either. Intellectualism, can we just say, has some value? Let's not say intellectualism has no value. I mean, we go to school for a reason. There's some good in learning. He says, I turn myself to behold wisdom. I mean, there's value to knowledge. And he's going to say here, if you look over at chapter 2 and look back down in verse 12, he's going to say here, wisdom excels folly and light excels darkness. Your eyes are better than being blind. I think we all agree with that. Light is better than darkness. The wise man is able to see something the fool cannot. His wisdom is a measure of light, but the fool lives in the darkness. I mean, people who don't know, in a sense, they are dark. They can't see what they don't understand because they haven't learned it yet. And so he says, having eyes is better than not having eyes. The one who is able to see is better because he walks so he can see where he's going. So human wisdom does provide some measure of human success, some preservation and protection, some strength, and even some joy. Wisdom applied provides means by which life is lived. You know, the more you know, you probably will live a better life in the sense that you'll accumulate more. Doesn't mean you'll be more satisfied. There is a sense of the ability to avoid life's problems with wisdom. And those who are in darkness, they just cannot see. The walk is problematic because they're going to trip and stumble. They have a greater probability of falling down. And anyone else testing this theory will come to the same conclusions. Listen, look at verse 12 again. The man who comes after the king, he says, is a likely referenced to a hypothetical successor who makes similar attempts to discover wisdom. He says, anybody who comes after me, who puts life to the test like I have, you will find just like I have, it's wanting. you will be just as unfulfilled as I have been. This is the problem with intellectualism, ladies and gentlemen. You've got all of these people who haven't gotten to the bottom of the well yet, and they say, come on, follow me into the well. Come on, jump in. And so you jump in and you walk after them. They're not quite to the end yet, and they're going to get to the end and go, ah! Stephen Hawking, where is he now? Neil deGrasse Tyson, where will he be soon? See, Solomon's going to make a point. He's going to say, fools and wise, we all end up at the same place, at the bottom of the well. Actually, just to let you on the little secret, the reason that Solomon keeps bumping into hell is because he comes to the realization that everybody dies. And there's no way out of it from a human perspective. That's the bottom of the well, death. And death is horrible. And so Solomon says, yes, anybody following me in Jerusalem who tries this is going to come to the same place. He says intellectualism will only end in despair. That's letter B. I myself, verse 14, second part, I myself perceived also the one event happens to them all. What is the one event? What's the one event? That's death. Then I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, so it happens even to me. So why was I more wise? I should have just had more fun. See, they're in a different well. In the intellectual well, you get to the bottom, you find death. You go, I wasted my life. I should have spent my life having fun. Doesn't that sound like modern America to you? Tell me it doesn't. We have so many devices that do the things of life that serve us. No, we don't have human servants. We don't believe in that. We don't have slaves. We eschew that. That's wrong. But we have devices that do all those things. All of those modern conveniences that we have in our homes, and even the poorest of us have those modern conveniences. They are the very things that servants used to do. You say, if I'm going to live my life and come to this, intellectualism was never the answer. I should have gone down the fun well. Surely that's the answer. Solomon's going to say no to that too. But he says it's all vanity, it's all emptiness. For there is no remembrance of the wise, verse 16, than the fool forever, seeing that which is now in the days to come which will be forgotten. And how dies the wise man? As the fool. Therefore I hated life. I hated life. He's going to later say, do you know what's better? Is if you die young, and even better that, if you were never born. Life has no answer. It only ends in despair. Everyone's life ends the same way. At the bottom of the fun well, at the bottom of the brain well, we both have death. It's the one event that Solomon's referring, that he personalizes. What happens to the fool is what happens to him. He's even going to say it happens to animals. I'm no better than a dog. And in that sense, there's no value in wisdom above folly, in knowledge above fun. The fool is forgotten, the same as the wise. And let me tell you, Solomon is forgotten. Now, yes, we have his words. We know he existed. So in that sense, he's not forgotten like we will be forgotten. There's nobody here on the level of Solomon in world history. I doubt it. Maybe one of the children will achieve something like that. Even the best achievers among us, on your tombstone, they'll say blah, 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 all these nice things, and people will walk by if they even care to go into a graveyard, which like 98% of you don't do. But for those of us who do, and you read the tombstone and you'll go, oh, that's great. Did you know a Supreme Court justice was here? Did you know a congressman is buried in our graveyard? I didn't know that. I've never even heard of the guy. He'll be forgotten. One of the things that I find very, very interesting is that I know the voices of some really famous people. Do you know their voices? This is just silly, but when Charles Barkley speaks on the radio, I know it's Charles Barkley. Now, I really don't care to know what Charles Barkley knows, okay? I mean, that's in the fun well, and that's an aside of the fun well that I don't want to be on. But when he talks, I know his voice. When Bill Clinton speaks, I know his voice. I imagine that some of you who lived a long time ago, you were, that's before me, right? Maybe only 10 years before me, but you know voices of people that you heard on the radio that I never heard, or that I didn't hear that I can remember. I can barely remember Richard Nixon's voice. Okay, so that's going back in the way back recesses. But some of you are a little older. You may remember voices you heard on the radio before me. But I know them because I go, oh, that's who that is. And my children are going, what? They don't know them, right? Because they're younger. Because they're gone. And while your name might last, and some of the things you write or do might last, you, in essence, are gone. The people who know you are gone. The things you did are gone. Your life is gone. The only way they can describe it is in fiction, because they really don't know you or what really happened. And a lot of history is fiction, by the way. We just fill in the gaps of things we don't know. That it's just despair. He says, what happens to the fool happens to me. There's no value in wisdom above folly, because the fool is forgotten, the same as the wise. So the wise man dies just like the fool. So in other words, he says, you go into the two wells. You go into the brain well, you go into the fun well. You go down into the mind well, you're right down there. You're getting down there farther and farther, and you keep thinking, I'm almost there. I've almost got the answers. I've almost figured it out. So I'm going to write a book called The Theory of Everything. How about that? There is a book with that title, I believe. The guy who wrote it's now dead. But I can try to explain everything. But you get to the end of the well, the bottom of the well, and you find out what? No stop sign, not here. Then you say, if you had a second life, I'm going to jump out of this well, and I'm going to go down the fun well, and I'm going to live with a whole bunch of people that you hear about on page 6 of the New York Post. Do you ever go to the New York Post and read page 6? It's just all pop culture. And you can find all about the Kardashians and the wedding that happened in Venice this weekend, where Jeff Bezos and his wife, Lauren Sanchez, got married, and you can find out what name she's going by now and the dress that she wore on the cover of Vogue. And you can find out that Anna Wintour is stepping away from her position after 30-something years as the head of a fashion magazine. And you can read all about that. You say, how do you know that? Because I read it. But you can read all about this. And you can get to the bottom of the fun well, and you can find out that who Leonardo DiCaprio is dating, if you want, or that some other famous actor has just broken up with some famous music star, and they're no longer dating, and now he's at the wedding and he's by himself, and it was kind of weird. And you can read about all this, and you jump down the fun well, and you get to the bottom of that well, and the fun runs out. And that's why Solomon says, so I hated life. Now, I was in the bottom of my fun well yesterday. I was scrolling through Instagram reels, and I came across a pastor who said Solomon was wrong. And I went, oh, that caught my attention. You just said Solomon was wrong? Well, he got confused. Ecclesiastes is hard, so I'd give him, look, it's a hard book, okay? But he's looking at this going, if this is truly what Solomon is saying as it's a positive thing, then he has to be wrong. In the sense that if he's saying I should pursue intellectualism, or I should produce hedonism, then Solomon's wrong. And he got kind of all twisted around. There are a lot of people who say this is Solomon as a cynic, as a critic of life, but he's wrong, because God says in the same book, through Solomon, you should love life and you should enjoy your life, and things that we'll get to later when we see life from God's perspective when lived for God. But I was sitting there looking at this, and I watched it like 4 or 5 times. Becky was driving and said, stop looking at the road and look at this. You got to see this. And she's like, I'm trying to watch the road. There's a reason why Solomon said, I hated life. Okay, at the bottom of the well, there's death. I hate life. I hate it. Because I lived my life for intellectual pursuits, I realized I didn't gain anything by it. And it's just despair. Well, I went a lot faster than I thought I would. See, you all were doing so well. So I'm not gonna take this any further. I'm gonna close here in a second, and you'll say, great, you preached shorter than I thought you would today. And I did. And I should get credit for that. I've got 5 illustrations I could give and take another 15 minutes, but I'm not going to do that. But I am going to close with this. One of the leaders of the wilds, where we're headed tomorrow with the children, one of the leaders of the wilds says this: only 2 choices on the shelf, serving God or serving self. I'm going to amend that statement. It's not nearly as poetic. Only 2 choices on the shelf. Solomon would say, serve God or hevel. Serve God or else. Serve God or find the despair that comes to a life lived for self. It's the kind of life that Paul was arguing for on Mars Hill. Live for God. All of you Epicureans, you've got it wrong. The simple life isn't the life. And all of you Stoics, you have it wrong. Keeping a stiff upper lip when going through trouble isn't the answer. There is an answer in the resurrected Son of God. And they've dragged him here. Do you realize this is the court of Athens that's gathered? One of the people who's going to, Dionysius. Do you know who Dionysius is named for? Dionysus, okay? And that god is Bacchus, if you look at it from a Roman perspective, a bacchanalia, a big, giant party. In New Orleans, every year, they have a bacchanalia. They have a feast, not to the god Bacchus, not to the Dionysus, but they have a feast, a celebration, and we call it Mardi Gras. Paul looks at these people and says, you have it wrong too. All of these people that he's arguing against, they could literally just push him off the cliff. And he still has the bloody marks of the Philippians who had beaten him some 6 weeks earlier on his back. They haven't healed yet. This man's crazy. But he's looking at people who he knows to be crazy and says, I have the answer. On the hill of one of your gods, in the shadow of the Parthenon, where your god Athena once stood, where her altar once was, where a statue to her still stood and was so bright it could be seen from maybe as much as 100 miles away. The gleam, it was so high in the air, and the gleam from the gold, it was so bright. He says, there's one named Jesus, and he's the one who is the answer. Only thing that matters, men and women, is the Lord. Everything else is hevel. Let's pray together. Lord, help us not to reject life because it's hevel, but to see that we can live life for you, and it's glorious, and it's wonderful, and it's fun, and it's good. And we know that this life ends, but we have a next life. And even in the misery and pain of life, we can see this eternal weight of glory that we live for. Help us to fight the good fight, to finish the race, to keep the faith, and to reject the hevel things of life. Before I finish praying,